Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. I'm just going to wait a couple of seconds whilst people do join the webinar this morning. But I'm Gillian Askew, and it's nice to see so many of you joining me this morning to talk about policy in public sector work. Whilst we're just giving a few seconds for people to join, please do feel free to say hi in the chat. Please do feel free to introduce yourself. We had a little bit of feedback recently that webinars can often just feel a little bit one way. I think somebody said, I felt like I was a bit in jail, in prison, and I wanted to chat more. So I'll go through it a bit in housekeeping in a second, but do feel free to say hi on the chat, say what your name is, where you're from, whereabouts in the country, or anything like that. Please do feel free to do so. We've got the session lined up for 45 minutes today. We'll be really strict with time, so we won't go over that, but we do have time for questions at the end. So hopefully, if you do have any questions as a result of today, and you want to ask them today, feel free. Otherwise, you can ask them outside of this session. So knowing that time is a little tight, and I can see lots of you joining, so let me crack on this morning. So first thing, introductions and housekeeping. So if you've been to any of our webinars before, you might already know who I am, but for those who are joining for the first time, my name is Gillian Askew, and I'm one of the co-founders of Go for Growth. Some things to tell you before we get started. The session is being recorded today, so a copy of the recording will be available via the Go for Growth YouTube channel after the event, but it'll also be emailed to you along with a copy of the slide deck that we're using today. Any links that we reference in the slide deck will also be included in the pack that we send out after. So they'll all be the live links in there, so you can click through. There are some videos in today. I'm playing one, but there are another couple that we don't have time to go through, but those links will be live for you to click through them when you get the slide pack out early next week. As always, as I said, there is a chat and Q&A function on Zoom. Please do feel free even to use both. Say hi, introduce yourself, but also do ask whatever questions or make comments as we go. It's just me today, so I will try and keep an eye on the Q&A and the chat as we go along. But I have put some time aside at the end for us to have any discussions or table any questions or any comments that come up as we go through. So if I don't get to them live, I will check everything at the end as well. For questions, if you want to use the Q&A function, that's helpful, but do use either Q&A or chat. Sometimes in Zoom, the functionality can just do what it feels like usually. So if the Q&A doesn't work, please do use the chat function. Usually one of them works, hopefully both, but please feel free to use either. So what we're covering today in the agenda is we're going to look at some basic policies that every organisation would probably need to have to be able to take part in public sector work. But we're going to think about the role of the policy as well, what it does for us, how to use it to our advantage. We've got a slide on how to write a policy. I'm not going to dwell on how to write one today, but there are a couple of links in there for you to use outside of this event that will help you write a policy if you are writing them from scratch. But we're also going to look at where we can get templates from. If you can utilise an already existing policy from somewhere else and cater it to yourself, so much the better. But then we'll focus a little bit on one of the big policy changes in the public sector over the last couple of years, and certainly one that's emerging as we go through public sector changes, and that's the policy around anchor strategy. So what it means to be an anchor institution and how that policy shift will impact us in small business owners or the voluntary sector, if we're micro or sole trader, etc. So we'll talk about what to expect from anchor strategy going forward as that big policy shift. And then really quickly at the end, just a little bit of information about how Go for Growth can help you if you need some support as we go through. And then, as I said, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So if we start with basic policies, it might seem like I'm teaching you to suck eggs, and forgive me if you already have all of these things. What I think is some of the lesser obvious on that list. So in GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, they changed a few years ago. So the DPA, which was the Data Protection Act, got updated. And actually, as a result of that, I think there was a few more things that the public sector are asking for around cybersecurity, around information assurance, around privacy policy and privacy statements. And so having a policy around how you protect data, not just your data, but your client's data. And if you're working where you might be using service user data, so if you're in the care sector or if you're working in the justice sector, for example, you might often be using service user data. We've just been writing a few bids ourselves, and data protection as a technical question has been asked and scored under evaluation. So it's shifting actually just from coming up in selection criteria where it's pass fail, do you have a data protection policy? But actually we're seeing in bids and tenders that you are being asked to write 500 words around how you protect data, how you protect clients' data, your own data, how you protect your servers, all of that stuff. So it's an emerging area, is that data protection regulatory environment. So one for us to look at. But the usual suspects are up there as well. So your HR policies around disciplinary, grievance, absence. But the big agenda item at the minute that's really climbing up the priority list, and it's a real positive that it is equality, diversity and inclusion, the ED&I agenda. And so lots of public sector organisations are really thinking about how they can be more accessible and more inclusive. And so what we're seeing is that they're asking their potential suppliers through that bid process about how we as organisations are also trying to be accessible and inclusive. And it's probably sometimes more than just a self-certification that we have an ED&I policy, but actually that narrative and that rhetoric around this is how we bring that policy to life, it's how we do it. The health and safety policies have been around forever. If you're working in construction or engineering or infrastructure type projects, you'll be really used to your health and safety policies, the risk assessments and method statement kind of environment, fire safety, and your accidents, incidents and near misses, and what you have to report, so read or reportable incidents, that kind of thing. They still maintain, if you're on things like construction line, actually, or a CHAS accreditation, for example, the Contractors Health and Safety accreditation, you might well be doing all of that all of the time. So it's a case of actually using that accreditation to your benefit from a policy perspective. But again, people will be looking for, usually in health and safety, the self-certification that you have then, but then you might see quality questions on, well, how do you, depending on what the subject matter of the contract is, how do you keep people safe? How do you put a safe system of work in your working environment? And then finally on this list, social values. So the Social Value Act, the Public Services Act, was assented to law back in 2013. It's the Social Value Act of 2012, Public Services Act it's called, of 2012, was assented to law in 2013. And so actually through all of the iterations of regulations and public sector development, social value is really becoming a high priority. And we're seeing evaluation weightings in social value of upwards of 10%, which is a real positive, actually, because as small businesses, we are a sum of all of our parts and we have more to offer than just the price that's on the commercials. And so actually, this feels like a real positive. But it does mean, again, that your policy probably will be asked for more than just a certification that you have a social value policy, but you'll need to explain how that policy helps you deliver social impact in your organisation. From a sustainability perspective, what we're seeing is more and more requirement to have either a net zero carbon or a carbon reduction type policy or an environmental policy. And these might go hand in hand with accreditation, not always. So you won't always be asked for the environmental management system of 14001. We are seeing the sustainability environment really become more robust in terms of how it's being tested in public sector procurement. So if you haven't got an environmental policy, if you haven't got a carbon management or carbon reduction policy, if you haven't got a social value policy, if you're not thinking about modern slavery, whether or not you qualify as an organisation that has to publish a modern slavery statement, which I think if you're turning over more than 36 million, that's when it kicks in. If you're not doing those things, it's still worth, I think, thinking about them. And they can often be a differentiator if they're not being asked for. If you have them and you're able to talk about them, then they can often be a differentiator. But certainly we're seeing more on social value and more on environmental considerations through bids and tenders, and especially with our net zero carbon target of 2050. And again, this probably feels quite obvious, but it's worth talking about the role of the policy. I think it's easy, and especially when you are a busy small business owner, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking policies, or at least some policies, are a bit of a tick box exercise. And if you don't have one, that just for the purposes of a bid, you can go out and get one. And it's true that you can use a template, and we'll talk a little bit about templates. And I'm definitely a fan of the path of least resistance, especially as a busy small business owner. Templates can be really helpful, but it is worth, I think, just making sure that we understand that the policy should be a reflection of how we work. It should be an extension of your values, and it should be one of those ways that we display what's important to us as a business. And it's also worth remembering that in a procurement environment, in a bid or a tender competition environment, these things might be tested. And it might be tested in the way I just talked about a second ago, in terms of confirm that you have a policy, then tell me about the policy and how you bring it to life in your organisation. But it might be tested in terms of asking for copies of it as well. And certainly anything that you do, policies included, anything that you put in your bid submission, if you're successful, it will become contractual. So if you talk about having an environmental policy, you'll be held to account for that policy if you're successful in winning the work. So whatever you put in there, it's worth being happy that it is a reflection of how you work. It is what's important to your business, and it is an extension of that cultural environment, that value set that you've got, because it will become contractual. And I think one of the areas where it can become a little more complex is if you're, for example, needing a safeguarding policy. So if the work that you're doing might see you working in a care, a health, or an education setting, for example, or even in the justice sector, if you're working around probation, you might be working with either children under the age of 18, young people, or those with vulnerabilities. And so actually a template of a safeguarding policy is not a bad place to start, but you will be needing to make sure that what you think about in that safeguarding policy and what you adopt in that safeguarding policy is a reflection of how you work, and a reflection of what's expected of you from a safeguarding perspective is contained in that policy. So how do you keep vulnerable adults or young people or children safe when you're working on their site? What do you do if somebody comes to you with some information that you need to pass on? Do you know who the safeguarding lead is for that organisation? Do you know how to keep children safe, basically, when you're working on that education site, for example, would need to be contained in that policy. We always talk about, actually, if you need a safeguarding policy or something like that, your client can be a good place to start. So the contracting authorities that you're bidding for, hopefully, are only asking for policies from you, from us as bidders, that they have also got. And so if you don't have a policy, you can ask for a copy of theirs to use as their template. And that can be really helpful because it lays out their expectations for you as well. And you know then what you're trying to adopt as an organisation. And the best example we have of this is an example that one of our co-founders had. He was asked for a water usage policy. It's not a standard policy at all, but his response was, absolutely, I'm happy to think about putting in place a water usage policy. I don't have one currently. Please resend me a copy of yours so I can work from yours to build my own. And embarrassingly, the answer was, actually, we don't have one. But that shouldn't stop us from asking. We should always ask our potential client for a copy of their policy, or to be pointed in the direction of where their policy is, so that we can potentially use that to build our own. We should also think about that review process. So most policies would be reviewed annually, and that's about version control. So capture that review, make sure that it's documented, keep a note of the versions somewhere in the policy, maybe at the top, so that you can evidence that not only do you have the policy, but it is living and breathing in your organisation. And here is some evidence that we review it each year to make sure that it's still fit for purpose. And that can often help, especially if you are having to write a narrative on that answer and it's a scored question rather than just a pass-fail in selection criteria. Being able to evidence that commitment to the policy through that review process can actually elevate your score. Sometimes it can be really helpful. And as a small business owner, I remember thinking about this last point myself. I've worked in big corporates, in FTSE 100 organisations who have got, 30, 40 policies. And I can't keep that amount in my head. When I became a small business owner many years ago, one of the things I thought about was that balance between quality of policy and volume of policy. I wanted my very small team to be able to remember the policy because it's helping us define and describe how we work and what's important to us. So if I've got 30 of them, I know that no one can keep that in their heads. So there is a balance and a proportionality at play in terms of what do I need from a policy perspective to help me run my business the way I want to run it, and how do I make sure that the team that I've got can understand those policies, sign up to them, adhere to them. And if we do have more than people can carry around in their head, I don't know about anybody else, I struggle to carry a few things in my head these days, then actually the best thing we can do is make sure they're accessible, communicate them well, communicate the location well. And you can use something called a toolbox talk. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. We use it in construction quite a lot. It's basically where we talk about the changes to a policy. We talk to our staff, our employees, our teams about where we keep those policies. And actually what we have is a signatory process so that everybody gets an opportunity to ask questions, to comment, but to also to basically confirm that they know where the policies are and they know what the policies are about. And so they know when to go and look at policy information. So keeping in our mind in terms of we might need to check something like a social media policy is a good example. If I'm about to tweet something and use my business's name, I probably need to check the social media use policy. Am I allowed to do that? Is it okay to do that? I can't remember the detail of the policy. So the best thing I need is to know where it is and something to be able to trigger for me that when I'm going to do something, I know we have a policy on it and I can go and figure out what's in it so that I do whatever it is I need to do in the right way. Hopefully everyone's still okay. There's no questions or chat just yet. So like I say, do please feel free to jump in if you need to. The next slide, there's a couple of guides in there. A big thank you to my colleague Andrew Chamberlain for putting together a video tutorial on how to write a policy, what to include in it. I also put together a guide for us in terms of how to write a policy. Both of these will be sent out with the slide deck. And I think the video tutorial is about 20 minutes long, so we'll not obviously play it today, but do feel free to click through those links when the slide deck comes out. So we'll think about templates. I mean, you might have to write a policy from scratch, and that's okay if you do need to. That guidance that Andrew's put together for us will be really helpful. But often taking a template and then building from there can be really useful. It certainly can be helpful in terms of maximising the time that's available to us and for knowing what our clients really want and expect out of a policy that we have. So using a template can be really useful. We've got some embedded in our public sector supplier ready accreditation, and I'll talk really briefly about that a bit later on. But if you're working through any of our digital platforms or doing any gap analysis work with us at Go for Growth, you'll see that there are templates in there. And some of those templates are about policy. So there's some useful stuff in there for you in our own programme. But actually, you might want something broader, or you might want to have a look at 2 or 3 different examples to work out what works best for you. Absolutely, perfectly fine. So if you're a member of an organisation such as the Federation of Small Businesses or local chambers of commerce, they will often have templates of policy that you can utilise. We've definitely used those in our own organisation more than once, and it's really helpful. and they will have been tested by legal teams and all the rest of it. So you know that you're getting a good quality template from organisations like that. If you're not a member of your local chambers or the Federation of Small Businesses, have a look. Actually, the membership fees are tailored to the size of business, and they can often be helpful in a much broader capacity than just for policy templates. So have a look. Outside of that, and in the HR space, specifically ACAS, which is the conciliation service, they're really good with HR policies. And they can also be a really useful repository for information if you need to get any guidance around how to manage staff, how to manage absence, or the rest of it from a practical perspective. But they've got lots of policy around paternity leave, maternity leave, absence policy, disciplinary grievance, all of that usual HR stuff. So if you're not retaining an organisation, and a retainer organisation can be helpful. I've certainly done that in a small business that I ran to help keep me up to date with HR policy. Changes in legislation can sometimes come thick and fast. And so having a policy is one thing, making sure that it's legally compliant and up to date is another thing entirely. But if you're not retaining an organisation to help you do that, then ACAS from an HR perspective is a really good place to go. We've talked a little bit about it already. Your client is a good place to start also, especially if you're thinking about a new policy because of a bid process that you're considering or you're in. Asking your potential client or asking a contracting authority locally. So if you're bidding for someone else's work, but you could go to still your local council to ask for their safeguarding policy, their water usage policy, their environmental policy, they will have a long suite. Often they are public domain information on the website. So if you go to Barnsley Council, City of Bradford Council, whoever, you want to have a look at their policies, you should be able to find at least what is required from a statutory perspective on the website. So you can download those things and have a look at what's in there. And then if you have accreditations, such as the Contractors Health and Safety accreditation, then that process of annual certification that you go through with those accreditations, Information Assurance 27001, Environmental Management 14001, the Health and Safety 18001, for example, or a CHAS accreditation, that will show your customer that you've been independently assessed and verified through the process of that accreditation. So it can often lighten the load a bit because you will have to have those policies as part of that accreditation. And things like construction line. So a lot of organisations will say if you're construction line silver, for example, then we don't need to ask you anymore. You are effectively pre-qualified almost. And so we don't need to check because that independent verification has already taken place. And so there is more than one route, I think, to getting your policy environment laid out. So if you haven't thought about those things, then perhaps you can going forward. But we come on to anchor strategy, and there is a 2-minute video in here, and I'm not going to play it now, actually, just because we're at 24 minutes, and I do want to make sure that we have time for questions at the end. But basically this video, it's a 2-minute video. It talks about the role of hospitals in that particular video as anchor institutions and how it works through improving population health and what it means in terms of the marketplace impact. The video talks about an anchor institution being called an anchor institution because it's rooted in place. It doesn't move. And so you would think about a university as being an anchor, the local authority being an anchor institution, police forces are rooted in a place that they are also an anchor institution, and obviously local government, the local council. And what you see is those anchor institutions often in a geographical environment coming together to work together as anchor institutions, exploring their role. And so although this slide speaks very specifically to health as a context, it is relevant to most public sector organisations, certainly those with a local base and a local remit. They would see themselves as an anchor institution. And it's a really big policy shift, which will impact all businesses, but actually it could be really beneficial as a policy move for smaller organisations and the voluntary sector. Please do feel free to have a watch of that video outside of this event. So if I sort of broadly consider what an anchor strategy means and why it's important to us as small business owners and voluntary sector, and it was the NHS that actually gave us this information in terms of this is a really big shift for public sector from a policy perspective. The video, when you watch it, you'll see at the end, the narrator in the video, he talks about community benefiting direction. And the video poses a question, in this case to directors of hospitals, but it's to everybody really in public sector who are rooted in place. Anchor policy related to being an anchor institution, it's being discussed up and down the sector. So we should think about what it means to you in the public sector. So that's the question that the video narrator poses to the public sector. How are you going to use this policy shift to the benefit of the communities in which you serve, that community benefiting direction? In practical terms, then, what it should mean over time, and anchor is still a relatively new policy shift, but in time it should improve how the public sector buys. And what do I mean by that? So I mean, as local areas come together to agree what being an anchor means and the policy environment that sits around that, what we should start to see as small business owners and voluntary sector providers, we should start to see more consistency across requirements within procurement opportunities. And I have a couple of examples of this actually in real terms. So Go for Growth did some work with the London Anchor Institution Network recently, so probably about a year ago now. And that work was really centred around looking at procurement processes and how we could alter and change procurement processes to remove barriers to small and diverse organisations. We made 10 recommendations in that report, and a good number of those recommendations are being taken forward by all of the members in the London Anchor Institution Network. And there are some big players in there. So the Greater London Authority, the London Met Police, the London Fire Brigade, Transport for London, etc. The London NHS is in there, and all the local authorities are a part of that network. So actually, if that cluster of organisations can come together as anchor institutions and work more consistently across things like, what policies are you asking for in procurements? Are they the same? So are you asking for the same levels of insurance on the same types of procurement? Are you asking for the same accreditations on the same types of procurement? Are you making it easy or difficult for a smaller organisation to take part in your opportunities? What the anchor policy does is it tries to help to create some consistency across those requirements. And I also just recently am doing some work for a local authority in Yorkshire, and what they are thinking about working with the local NHS Trust as two big anchor institutions in that borough, how they can come together to support the marketplace. So how they can look at how they go out to market, what they put in their procurement processes, what they ask for from providers. If they can create some consistency in that process, then actually it will be easier for smaller providers to take part. So it will be more equitable an environment. So everybody will have a similar requirement in terms of taking part. On that London Anchor Institution Network stuff that I talked about, I'll put a link into the London Anchor's website, and there is some case studies on there. So there is a whole section on procurement, and what you'll see is some of that narrative that I've just talked about in there. You can have a look at what they're doing. If you're London based especially, that will be useful to you. But I think wherever you are, have a look at what's on both the video on that anchor strategy shift, policy shift, and have a look at the London Anchor's website, and it will give you some really good insights into what anchors mean and what people are trying to use anchor institution as a network for in terms of the impact on us as local providers. But what it really shifts for us is for smaller providers, local providers, diverse providers, voluntary sector providers, it's actually been disproportionately harder, I think, for those organisations to take part. It's not particularly equitable. But what anchor strategy and anchor policy does is actually, it means that if you're also rooted in place as a provider, the smallness, the localness, that becomes a strength, it becomes an advantage. So actually it can help us to be more attractive for the very reason that we're just us, to stand out in those bid competitions. So it can be really meaningful in terms of that policy shift for us. Also, if you think about sustainability and social impact, as local providers, actually what I see is that we do loads of this. So actually we make lots of impact on our local environment, lots of impact on our local community, lots of impact socially, just through the very nature and course of our business. And that's the same whether we are in, you know, the care sector or a health sector or working directly with the community. Actually, the impact that we have on the local economic environment because of where we are, how we recruit, who we recruit, how we retain jobs, how we develop our people, all of those things. It helps us. I think we are, you know, really good at that stuff. We might not necessarily always talk about it enough, but I think there's some real talented and lots of impact in that area. What anchor policy might do is it'll help us actually stand out in those areas. It gives us an opportunity to differentiate because we're also rooted in place, or we can be, or we can impact in a local area. So the anchor policy gives us an opportunity to make sure that our size, our location, our capabilities is a real strength, and therefore we can compete in a much more equitable way. And so really quickly, just for a couple of minutes, I wanted to finish the session today before we go for questions, just to give a real brief overview of how Go for Growth can help. So our job is to help connect the public sector with the marketplace. And so we've got tons of aspiration and ambition in the public sector about working with local providers, smaller providers, voluntary sector, etc., creating that accessibility piece. And there is so much talent in the marketplace, and yet it's really difficult. There's a disconnect in bringing those two communities together. What we're trying to do is sit and bridge that gap a little bit so that we can help those two communities find each other and connect better. Our job is to help you find an opportunity, learn about the process of taking part, help you get ready for bids and tenders, help you get started with social and environmental stuff, or help you tell the story of what you're already doing in the context of a bid. And how we do that is a number of ways. So you can understand this is the what we do. So helping you understand the public sector process, how to take part. There's lots and lots of different portals out there, so we'll help you navigate all of those portals, process and policy guidance. Also, it's not just for competitions, for bids and tenders, but any funding application really. We've supported on lottery funding, we support on grants all of the time. So if you are trying to grow in the public sector somehow, or in the not-for-profit sector, you know, give us a shout and we'll try and help you. And the how we do that is a number of ways. So we do provide personalised support. You can come to us for one-to-one coaching. We do lots of events, training guidance. We've got online courses. I talked about the gap analysis and the public sector supplier ready status. We've created a certified programme that allows you to demonstrate your readiness to take part to your potential public sector clients. So there is a URL, a link on the next slide to getting there. We'll help you complete the standard selection questionnaire so that when the clock isn't ticking, you can get all of the knowledge that you need and all of your capability ready to be able to take part. And everything that we do is offered free of charge. So we're funded by the public sector, so they invest in it so that we can offer that out at no cost to providers. So please feel free to access the programme in as much or any way that you would like to. We're here to help. And then finally, if you want to have a chat with us, please feel free. There's some of our social media links on there. There's mine and my colleague Lauren's mobile numbers and email addresses. And we also have a bookable calendar. So if you want to have a one-to-one with us, you can book a 30-minute Teams session through that booking link there. And just at the bottom here is the Public Sector Supply Ready accreditation. If you want to get that, you can certainly go through. So And then the last thing before we go to questions, if you would like to stay in touch with us, we hate getting spammed as a business ourselves, as people ourselves. We don't spam, but what we might do is talk to you about events that are coming up, online courses, and we also post out about opportunities that the public sector let us know are coming, and they'd like us to let the businesses that we're working with know about it. We won't write to you unless you sign up, and you can always opt out. So if you do want to get some up-to-date opportunity news or event news, things like that, please do feel free to sign up to our mailing list. We promise we won't make that a bad decision, for sure. And that was it from me. I would just like to firstly say thank you to everybody for sticking with it. That's 35 minutes of policy and a little bit on Go for Growth. And I'll open it up to you guys. If there are any questions or any comments, please do so. Often on a webinar, I know it can be difficult to think of what questions you have, and you might come up with something later. When the slide deck comes out to you, please do feel free to use the contacts that are on there if you do have any questions, or if you want to have a chat, not just on policy, on anything related to the public sector. I've been in public sector procurement for a lot of my career, and I'm 30 years in my procurement career. So it is a space that I know really well. So do feel free to get in touch on any part of it, and we would be more than happy to help. I'll just give it a couple more seconds to see if anybody is busily writing away in the Q&A or in the chat, but I can't see anything at the minute. No, nothing in chat, nothing in Q&A. I know we're all super busy as business owners, so what I never do is make us wait until we've had 45 minutes if there are no questions. So if there aren't anything, the final thing to say would be thank you from me for coming along. I really hope today's been useful. We do send out a poll with our slide decks just to ask you how today went. We don't want to be a nuisance to you, and we don't want to tie you up for 45 minutes on something that isn't valuable. And if there are other topics that you would like to hear from us on, so some feedback we got recently was on the social value, themes, outcomes and measures, the TOM. So we're just thinking about how we can do that. We will always take that feedback on board and try and do something with it. So please do fill that poll out for us. It's really useful for us to know what best support we can give out. So if there's no more questions or nothing in the chat, thank you again for joining me, and I hope everybody has a lovely day. The slides will be out with you early next week. Thank you ever so much.